In the Maritime Archives of the National Archives of Australia in Canberra, there exists a collection of ship manifests bound in deteriorating leather, their pages foxed with age and sea salt. These documents record the arrival of vessels at Port Phillip, Sydney Harbour and Fremantle between 1838 and 1914, and within their columns, written in the careful copperplate of harbour clerks, are the names of children. Thousands upon thousands of children. The manifests note their ages, some as young as 3, most between 7 and 14, their port of embarkation, typically London, Liverpool or Plymouth, and their designation, orphan, destitute child, ward of the state. What the manifests do not record, in most cases, is any surname that can be traced to a living parent, any next of kin, any point of origin before the workhouse or the industrial school. The children appear in the documentary record as though they materialized from institutional fog, their histories beginning at the moment they stepped onto the gangplank. Between 1838 and 1914, official estimates place the number of unaccompanied minors transported to Australia at approximately 90 to 100,000. The anomaly is not the number itself, but the silence that surrounds it. A population transfer of this scale, involving children who could not consent and parents who left almost no trace, executed across 7 decades with industrial efficiency, and yet the average Australian has never heard of it. The official explanation is thorough and, on its surface, entirely reasonable. Britain in the 19th century faced what contemporaries called the child surplus problem. The workhouses and industrial schools overflowed with children whose parents had died, abandoned them, or been rendered incapable of care by poverty, disease, or the disruptions of industrialization. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 had centralized the management of destitution, and the institutions it created were never designed for long-term child rearing. Emigration offered a solution that appeared humanitarian to Victorian sensibilities. Remove the child from the moral contamination of urban poverty, transport them to a colony where land was abundant and labour scarce, and allow them to grow into productive settlers. The various child emigration schemes, organized by charitable societies like Dr. Barnardo's, the Fairbridge Society, the Catholic Church, and government bodies, framed themselves explicitly as rescue operations. The children, it was argued, would have better lives in Australia than they ever could in the slums of London or the tenements of Liverpool. The ships themselves were inspected, the children given medical examinations, the receiving institutions in Australia subjected to at least nominal oversight. This is the story as it has been told, a misguided but well-intentioned effort to solve 2 problems simultaneously: the excess of unwanted children in Britain and the shortage of labour in Australia. What this explanation does not account for is the systematic erasure of identity that preceded embarkation. It does not explain why children with living parents were classified as orphans. It does not explain why records were destroyed, altered, or simply never created. It does not explain why, when the Australian Senate conducted an inquiry in 2001 and survivors testified, the most consistent theme was not hardship or abuse, though those were present in abundance, but the total severance from any knowledge of who they had been before the ship. A woman named Margaret Humphreys, a Nottingham social worker, began investigating in 1986 after a woman approached her claiming to have been sent to Australia as a child and told her parents were dead, only to discover decades later that her mother had been alive the entire time, searching for her. Humphreys would eventually locate over 1,000 such cases. The parents had not abandoned their children. The children had not been orphans. But the ships had sailed anyway, and the records had been written to make the children disappear from their own histories. The phrase we use is child migration. The documents call them orphan ships or emigration schemes. But what arrived at Australian ports between 1838 and 1914 and continuing in diminished form until 1970 was something else entirely. These were not rescue vessels. They were instruments of population transfer. The children were not emigrants, a word that implies choice, intention, the carrying of one identity to a new place. They were cargo, relabeled and rerouted, their origins erased so thoroughly that many would spend their entire adult lives believing themselves to be people they were not. We call them orphan ships. We should call them identity erasure vessels. We should call them the floating machinery of demographic reconstruction. Before you dismiss that framing as hyperbolic, follow the specific evidence, not the theory. The evidence. Consider what it takes to move 100,000 children across 12,000 miles of ocean. Consider the logistics of sourcing them, processing them, transporting them, and distributing them upon arrival. Consider the paperwork that would normally accompany such a movement: birth certificates, baptismal records, admission documents to workhouses, letters from parents, court orders of guardianship. Then consider how little of that paperwork survives, and how much of what does survive contradicts itself or contains obvious fabrications. The gaps in the archive are not accidental. They are structural. They are the signature of a system designed to produce untraceable people. The through-line image that connects every piece of evidence in this investigation is the child's name on the manifest, written once at the moment of departure, often misspelled, frequently invented, and then carried for a lifetime by a person who had no way of knowing whether it was real. The name on the manifest is the point where a human being becomes a statistic, where a family line is severed, where memory itself is made contingent on the accuracy of a harbour clerk's penmanship. Return to those archives in Canberra, and you will find children listed as John Smith, age 9, orphan, a name so generic it functions as a placeholder, a label assigned to fill a column rather than to identify a person. You will find siblings separated and given different surnames. You will find the same child appearing on 2 different manifests with 2 different names, as though the system could not keep track of its own inventory. The name on the manifest is the lie made permanent, the severance made official, the beginning of a life built on documentary sand. The next fact changes everything, and it is hidden in the arithmetic of Australian demography. In 1851, the non-Aboriginal population of Australia stood at approximately 437,000. By 1901, it had reached 3.8 million. The gold rushes explain some of this growth, as does natural increase and adult immigration. But the official histories of Australian population growth consistently undercount the contribution of child migrants, in part because the children were absorbed into the population without distinct statistical categories, in part because many were sent to rural areas where they simply became Australian within a generation, their British origins forgotten or suppressed. The child migration schemes were not a footnote to Australian settlement. They were one of its engines, supplying labour to farms, and domestic service, filling the demographic gaps left by a colony that had far more land than people to work it. The question that no official history adequately answers is simple. Why children? Adult laborers were available. Adult emigrants could be recruited with incentives. Why specifically target minors who could not refuse, who had no legal standing to resist, who could be shaped into whatever the receiving colony required? The answer that emerges from the primary sources is uncomfortable, and it concerns not just labor, but reproduction. The children sent to Australia were selected, in many cases, for their youth and their health. They were sent to a colony where the sex ratio was severely imbalanced, where single men outnumbered single women by margins that threatened social stability. The girls among the child migrants were explicitly expected to become wives and mothers. Internal correspondence from the emigration societies makes this plain. The boys were expected to become agricultural workers and later soldiers. This was not rescue. This was human resource planning conducted on a civilizational scale, with children as the raw material. The orphan ships were not vessels of charity. They were instruments of demographic engineering. And the erasure of the children's identities was not a bureaucratic failure, but a design feature. Because a child with no past, no family, no claim to any inheritance or belonging is a child who can be made into anything the receiving society requires. Consider the case of the Fairbridge Farm School in Malong, New South Wales. Between 1938 and 1974, this single institution received approximately 1,500 children from Britain, children who arrived with what the official records describe as incomplete documentation, a phrase that appears with such frequency across Australian child migration archives that it functions less as an explanation and more as a category unto itself. The Fairbridge Society's own internal correspondence, portions of which were released during the 2009 Australian Senate inquiry, reveals something that the word incomplete does not capture. In a 1947 letter between the Society's London office and its Australian counterpart, an administrator writes that the children's files were simplified for transport, a phrase whose bureaucratic blandness conceals an act of deliberate reduction. Birth certificates were replaced with standardized departure cards. Baptismal records, when they existed, were filed separately and often lost. Family histories, medical records, school reports, all the paper that might connect a child to a specific origin, a specific community, a specific claim, were stripped away in what the letter describes as a streamlining process. The official explanation is wartime necessity combined with institutional efficiency. Paper was scarce, shipping space was limited, administrative resources were stretched thin. But here is what that explanation does not account for. The children who arrived at Fairbridge from 1950 onward, well after the war had ended, well after shipping had normalized, well after paper rationing had ceased, arrived with the same simplified files, the same absent birth certificates, the same blank spaces where a past should have been. The wartime excuse had evaporated, but the practice continued unchanged. The empty ledger reappears here in a form more explicit than anywhere else, not as a document that has been lost, but as a document that was never created in the first place, or was created only to be immediately reduced to its most functional minimum: a name, an approximate age, a ship, a destination, everything else, white space. But that was only one farm, one institution, one archive. The next case changes the scale entirely. The Bindoon Boys Town operated by the Christian Brothers in Western Australia, received children from 1936 until 1966. The official count stands at approximately 600 boys. The Christian Brothers' own records, such as they are, list arrivals by ship name and year, sometimes by first name only, occasionally by a surname that cannot be matched to any British birth registry. When former residents began seeking their own files in the 1990s, they encountered something more troubling than missing documents. They encountered documents that had clearly been altered. Harold Haig, one of the first Bindoon survivors to publicly testify about his experience, described obtaining his file in 1997 and discovering that his listed age at arrival had been changed from 9 to 12. His birth date had been shifted by 3 years, and his place of birth had been recorded as unknown, despite the fact that he possessed a letter from his own mother, written before his departure, listing his birth address in Manchester. The official explanation was clerical error, compounded over decades of institutional record keeping. But here is what clerical error does not explain. The alterations to Haig's file all moved in one direction, toward greater ambiguity, toward less specificity, toward a past that could not be verified. Random errors distribute randomly. These did not. The institutional oversight that was meant to preserve these children's identities did precisely the opposite, and it did so with a consistency that random failure cannot produce. Perhaps you are thinking, this is simply the chaos of mid-century record-keeping, the inevitable degradation that happens when paper files pass through multiple hands across multiple decades. Before you dismiss that, follow the specific evidence, not the theory, the evidence. The Maltese children provide a different angle entirely. Between 1950 and 1965, approximately 310 children were transported from Malta to Australia under a bilateral agreement between the Maltese and Australian governments. Unlike British children, whose records were scattered across dozens of charities and religious orders, the Maltese children came through a single coordinated program with governmental documentation at both ends. Malta is a small island. Birth registries are centralized. Catholic baptismal records are comprehensive. The paper trail should be impeccable. And yet, when Maltese Australian researchers began attempting to trace these children's origins in the 2000s, they discovered something the official frameworks could not explain. Of the 310 children, only 247 can be matched to verifiable Maltese birth records. The remaining 63 appear in Australian arrival documents with Maltese names, Maltese departure stamps, and Maltese shipping manifests, but no corresponding Maltese births. The official explanation is that these children were likely from orphanages in Gozo or from families who did not register births through the church. But Malta had compulsory birth registration from 1863, and Gozo's records are preserved in the same national archive as Malta's. The 63 unmatched children did not come from a gap in Maltese record keeping. They came from somewhere else entirely, or they came from nowhere that anyone will name. The empty ledger here is not a British phenomenon, not an institutional failure of one charity or one religious order. It is a pattern that appears wherever these ships docked, in whatever bureaucratic system they touched. The mathematics of this program refuse to close. The official estimate, established by the 2001 Senate Community Affairs References Committee report, places the total number of child migrants sent to Australia between 1920 and 1970 at approximately 100,000. This number has become canonical. It appears in government apologies, in memorial plaques, in academic papers, in the names of inquiry reports themselves. But trace the arithmetic that produced it, and something unsettling emerges. The 100,000 figure was derived by aggregating the records of 27 known child migration schemes: Fairbridge, Barnardo's, the Christian Brothers, the Sisters of Mercy, the Catholic Episcopal Migration and Welfare Association, and so forth. Each organization provided its own count based on whatever records it had retained. These counts total approximately 67,000 children across all schemes. The remaining 33,000, one-third of the canonical total, is described in the Senate report as an adjustment for unreported schemes and incomplete institutional records. This is not a count. This is a placeholder. The adjustment assumes that for every 2 children documented, 1 additional child arrived undocumented, unrecorded, unaccounted for by any surviving institutional archive. The report does not explain how this ratio was derived. It does not cite a source. It simply states that the adjustment reflects the likely scale of informal arrangements and organizational gaps. Here is the math that does not close. If 33,000 children arrived outside any documented scheme, they would have required ships, births, receiving institutions, ration cards, school enrollments, medical examinations, eventual employment records. 33,000 is not a rounding error. It is the population of a small city. Where did they sleep? Where did they eat? Where are the institutional logs, the school registers, the medical files? The answer the official record provides is nowhere. They exist as a number attached to nothing. The 100,000 is not a count of identified children. It is a count of identified children, plus an admission that the true number is unknowable, the gap itself serving as the only evidence of its own existence. And the institutional structures that might have investigated this gap, the academic departments, the government archives, the genealogical societies, were precisely the structures that had the least incentive to disturb it. The funding landscape for historical child migration research in Australia reveals something about why certain questions remain unasked. Between 2010 and 2020, the Australian Research Council funded 4 projects related to child migration, totaling approximately $1.2 million. All 4 focused on the post-arrival experiences of children: institutional abuse, psychological trauma, survivor testimony. None examined the pre-departure documentation, the shipping logistics, the actual mechanisms by which children were selected, transported, and processed. This is not conspiracy. This is categorical assumption hardened into funding priority. The children are framed as victims of institutional abuse, which they undeniably were, and that framing directs research toward abuse and away from the deeper question of origins. Who were these children before they became orphans? Were they orphans at all? The first question leads to trauma studies. The second leads somewhere no funding body has chosen to go. The archives exist. The shipping records of the P&O, the Orient Line, the Shaw Savill companies. These are preserved in maritime museums in Southampton, Liverpool, and London. The children were listed by name on passenger manifests, often in separate sections marked child migrants or juvenile passengers. Cross-referencing these manifests against British birth registries, against workhouse intake logs, against charity case files would establish, for the first time, how many of the 100,000 can actually be traced to a documented British origin and how many cannot. The technology is mundane: database queries, optical character recognition of digitized records, standard genealogical methodology applied at scale. The Senate inquiry recommended exactly this work in 2001. 23 years later, it has not been done. The reason is not conspiracy. The reason is structure. To understand why the records have not been matched at scale, you must understand how historical research is funded in Australia and Britain. Funding bodies: the Australian Research Council, the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. Private foundations like the Wellcome Trust operate on competitive grant cycles. Researchers submit proposals. Proposals are reviewed by panels of established scholars. Grants are awarded to projects that fit within recognized disciplinary boundaries and promise publishable outcomes within 3 to 5 years. The child migration question does not fit. It is not history because it extends into living memory and carries legal implications for living institutions. It is not social work because the cohort is aging out of the welfare system. It is not genealogy because academic historians regard genealogy as amateur antiquarianism rather than serious scholarship. It is not demography because demographers study populations, not individuals. And the question here is precisely about individuals, about whether 100,000 specific children can be traced to 100,000 specific British origins. The question falls between every established category. Grant applications that attempt to address it are rejected, not because reviewers find the question unimportant, but because they cannot determine which discipline should assess it. A historian reviewing the proposal asks why it is not being submitted to a social policy funding stream. A social policy reviewer asks why it is not being framed as a historical investigation. The proposal circulates. It is praised as interdisciplinary. It is funded by no one. There is a second structural barrier, and it is more significant than the first. The institutions that hold the records, the churches, the charities, the government departments, are also the institutions that would face liability if the records revealed systematic fraud. The Catholic Church, which operated Bindun, Tardun, Castledare, and Clontarf in Western Australia alone, has already paid millions in compensation to former child migrants for physical and sexual abuse. If record matching revealed that a significant percentage of those children were obtained through documentation fraud, shipped without parental consent, with fabricated death certificates, with identity papers that named non-existent British addresses, the liability would extend beyond abuse to something closer to trafficking. The institutions have every incentive to keep the records unmatched. This is not conspiracy. This is incentive structure. The churches are not meeting in secret rooms to suppress evidence. They are simply not volunteering resources to an investigation that could only harm them. They respond to lawful requests. They do not initiate comprehensive audits. This is rational institutional behavior. It is also the reason the work has not been done. The third barrier is the most subtle. The former child migrants themselves are divided. Some want the full truth, whatever it reveals. Others have built lives, identities, families around the narratives they were given. A man who was told at age 7 that his mother was dead and has believed that for 70 years may not want to discover that his mother was alive, that she searched for him for decades, that she died in a council flat in Manchester without ever seeing him again. Some survivors have said publicly that they do not want researchers disturbing what remains of their peace. The oral historians and social workers who advocate for survivors are caught between the imperative to document and the imperative to protect. Many have chosen protection. The records remain unmatched. What would resolution look like? The technology is not exotic. It exists. It is used every day by companies like Ancestry.com and Find My Past, which have digitized and indexed hundreds of millions of British vital records. The same optical character recognition that allows amateur genealogists to search the 1939 Register or the 1921 Census could be applied to the Australian receiving home registers. The same database matching algorithms that identify possible family connections for paying subscribers could be run against the entire corpus of child migration documentation. The specific technology is called probabilistic record linkage. It was developed in the 1960s by statisticians working on epidemiological studies who needed to match medical records across different databases without unique identifiers. The algorithm assigns weights to matching and non-matching fields: name, date of birth, place of origin, parents' names, and calculates a probability score for each potential link. Modern implementations can process millions of record pairs per hour. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare uses this exact methodology to link Medicare records to hospital admission data. The technique is mature, validated, and legally accepted. Applied to child migration, probabilistic record linkage would work as follows. The input would be the 100,000 Australian receiving records, each containing whatever identifying information was recorded at arrival: name, claimed age, claimed birthplace, sponsoring organization, ship, date. The comparison database would be the digitized British records, birth registrations, baptismal records, school enrollment logs, poor law union admission books, the 1939 Register, which captured every person in England and Wales on September 29, 1939. The algorithm would generate a probability score for each potential match. High-confidence matches would establish verified origins. Low-confidence matches would flag records for manual review. Non-matches, children whose Australian receiving documents cannot be linked to any British origin record, would be isolated and counted. The count is the point. Right now, no one can say what percentage of the 100,000 cannot be traced. Estimates range from 15% to 40%, depending on who is estimating and what assumptions they make about record survival. The actual number is knowable. It is knowable with existing technology, existing digitized records, and existing algorithmic methods. A well-funded research team with access to both British and Australian archives could complete the linkage in 2 to 3 years. What would the number mean? If 95% of child migrants can be matched to verified British origins, the phenomenon remains what the official narrative describes: a misguided but documented welfare program. If 70% can be matched, something more troubling emerges: a system that lost track of nearly a third of the children it moved, through incompetence or negligence or something else. If 50% cannot be matched, the numbers no longer support the founding assumption. You cannot call something a child migration scheme if half the children cannot be shown to have migrated from anywhere. The work has not been done because no one with the resources to do it has the incentive to do it, and no one with the incentive to do it has the resources. And so the ships remain what they have always been. We speak of child migration as a policy that ended. We speak of the apologies as closure. We speak of the survivors as a dwindling cohort whose memories will soon pass from living witness into archival record. But the ships did not stop when the last documented child stepped onto Australian soil in 1970. The ships stopped when we agreed to stop seeing them. The SS Ormond, the SS Strathnaver, the SS Asturias, the SS Otranto. These are names in passenger manifests now, curiosities for maritime historians, occasional exhibits in migration museums where schoolchildren learn that Australia was built by brave journeys across the sea. The holds are empty. The bunks are gone. The children who slept there are grandparents now, or they are names in cemetery registers, or they are neither because their names were never their names, and the cemeteries do not know who is buried in unmarked plots behind institutions that have been demolished and replaced with shopping centres and housing developments. 100,000 is not a population estimate. 100,000 is a policy output, the number the system recorded as moved, processed, delivered. The actual children, the ones who stood on docks in Liverpool and Tilbury and Southampton, the ones who watched the coast of England recede and did not understand that they would never see it again. The ones who arrived in Fremantle and Melbourne and Sydney with shipping tags around their necks like parcels. Those children exist in memory and in fragments and in the spaces between records that do not quite match. The number could be verified, the origins could be traced, the gaps could be measured and named. The technology is waiting, the records are digitized, the algorithms are proven. All that is missing is the decision to look. And here is what the child migration question reveals about the limits of human knowledge itself. We believe that the past is recoverable. We believe that archives preserve what happened. We believe that if something occurred at scale, if 100,000 children were moved across the world, then surely the documentation exists. Surely the records can be assembled. Surely the truth can be established by anyone willing to do the work. We believe that the unknown is simply the not yet researched, that sufficient funding and sufficient effort will close every gap. But some silences are not gaps. Some silences are structures. The child migration records are not missing because they were lost in fires or floods or the ordinary entropy of paper over time. They are discontinuous because the system that created them was designed to move children, not to remember them. The intake forms asked what the institution needed to know: age, health, sponsoring organization, ship. They did not ask what the child needed to know: mother's address, father's occupation, siblings' names, the parish where baptism occurred, the school where letters could be sent. The records are incomplete because completeness was never the purpose. And now, 70 years later, we discover that the system's output is the only record we have, and the system's output was never designed to answer the questions we are asking. This is not unique to child migration. This is the condition of historical knowledge itself. We know what was recorded. We cannot know what was not. We can count the ships that sailed. We cannot count the children who were taken from families that were never told they had the right to refuse. We can read the receiving registers. We cannot read the letters that were never written because the children were told their parents were dead. The archive preserves the system's account of itself. The archive does not preserve what the system chose not to see. 100,000 children crossed the ocean. Some number of them, we do not know how many, arrived without origins that can be verified. They built lives. They had children and grandchildren. They became Australian. And beneath that becoming, beneath the names they were given and the stories they were told, there is a silence that extends backward across the water to a country that has no record of their leaving, to families that may have searched or may have grieved or may never have known that anyone was missing. The ships are gone now. The institutions are closed. The apologies have been delivered. And still, somewhere in the unmatched space between the British records and the Australian records, there are children who have not been accounted for. We call them orphans. We call them migrants. We call them the fortunate ones, saved from the slums of industrial Britain, given new lives in the sunshine of the Commonwealth. But we do not call them by their names, because we do not know their names, and we have not yet decided that we want to.